With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. One of our favorites. We love talking to him. He's the malarkey correspondent for The Independent, or so he says. That's because he covers Congress, also writes for MSNBC, a few other places. Eric Garcia, reporter extraordinaire. How are you, sir?
Right. How you doing, my man?
Fantastic. We're going to talk about Congress a little bit later on, but I wanted to start talking about Latinos because we've been talking about them in a political sense. They were a big item. They were really the headlining item on the census data. When you look at it, largest growing group, naturally growing group, not through immigration, through births, those sorts of things. But you had to touch on the fact that it's a very diverse group. And you wrote in The Independent, you took off of something where, here we go again. Somebody said something stupid on the internet, attacking AOC, but you took it in an interesting direction about the diversity of Latinos and how they're perceived. Just talk about that piece for a minute for folks.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was something like, so Tucker Carlson basically called AOC and entitled The White Lady. And let's start out by saying that Tucker Carlson has an agenda. And Tucker Carlson was just being a jerk. But one of the things that was interesting to me is that he called her entitled white lady, and of course AOC sees herself as a person of color. And the point to me was that Tucker Carlson really, he doesn't have any room to talk about this because even Latinos don't have a hard definition of who's white and who isn't. So a lot of Latinos, for example, for many years, so for example, a lot of Cubanos, I think something like 85% of Cubanos in America are likely to, in 2010, they were likely to identify as white alone. And that plays a role in how they see themselves in identity and how they saw themselves in relation to the civil rights movement. Whereas I grew up, one of my second or third cousins wrote a whole book about the history of Chicano pride in America. And then conversely but then also at the same time, there are Afro-Cubans. And Afro-Cubans, obviously are Black, and they obviously experience racism on the island, but they also experience racism in the United States. And their experiences are uniquely different. And at the same time, and it's not just, I think a lot of people say well, that's just the Cubans. They're, they came to the United States because of communism and because of the Cold War and things like that. But even if you go to some parts of the border in the Rio Grande Valley, a lot of Tejanos will say, yo no soy gringo, yo no soy mexicano, yo soy Tejano, which is to say, I'm not white, I'm not Mexican, I'm Tejano. And even then, a lot of them will say that they're white. And a perfect example of this is growing up, my dad told me that his dad, my grandpa, used to hear this saying, if you're white, you're all right. If you're brown, stick around. If you're Black, go back. And I thought that was just apocryphal until I was listening to an old Big Bill Broonzy song that said that exact phrase. So I think that the point being is that that the entire question of who's white and who is not is one that divides Latinos constantly. And I don't think that, we're never going to really have a hard agreement on it, because if you get 5 different Latinos of different ethnicities, as one Latino activist in Arizona told me, we don't even eat the same rice, so we're not going to have the same agreements on anything else. So that was the point I was trying to make, is that we don't even agree on who's white and who's a person of color and things like that. So Tucker Carlson sure as hell doesn't. So
I love any answer that gets music and food in your explanation. That's fantastic. Look,
exactly.
just in our circle of friends that contributed to this program, look at the people we talked to. We just had Mark Yazagiri on talking about the Rio Grande Valley. Yes. You wouldn't know unless you looked at his last name and he started talking to you about it. Our friend Dennis Saunders, a Black man in Minneapolis. You wouldn't know he's from Puerto Rico. This is a diversity thing. And I think the first thing is you don't want to assume, because when you start assuming, that's when your prejudices and your priors and your ignorance starts coming out. And with the Latino group, we just talked about the census data. It's the fastest growing group. It's also the fastest diversifying group in America.
Yes.
This is just something we keep wanting to talk about this in politic terms. this is a massive cultural shift for the Latino people, and there's a lot of different kinds of them.
Yeah. So like I think the 2020 census data showed that something like the number of Latinos who identify as white dropped to 20%, while the number that is selected two or more races jumped from 6% to 33%. And anybody who, and the numbers who identify as others spiked from like 37% to 42%. So, and then comparatively in like 2010, this data showed that like about 53% identify as white, 53%. So this is not a group that's set in stone. Their identity shift, their how they identify, how they see themselves as Americans shift, how they to the point that you mentioned, that how you would never know. My mom, when we were growing up, we lived in Florida for like 2 years. My mom is Mexican. My mom is proud to be Mexican. But if you saw her, she has a really light complexion. So a lot of people in Miami thought she was white or thought she was Cuban. And then, and it wasn't until and then she's like, no, I'm Mexican. So I think that the fact that these diverging identities are constantly changing is kind of in some ways the story of America, because in 1930, I didn't get to mention this in my piece, but like in 1930, the 1930 census included Mexican Americans, and then it took it out, and then it wasn't until the 1970 or the 1980 census that the term Hispanic was included. So these terms are malleable. People enter in and out of them all the time because they're imperfect, just like any term, they're imperfect and they're not going to capture everything. So it makes sense that people would, that they're hard to, classify.
Yeah, and we know, talking to Eric Garcia, he writes for The Independent along with a lot of other things. Also has a great book we'll talk about in a little bit. Certified Latino, to talk about Latino issues today. We know that education and economics are a big part of how a culture changes and views itself. You were tweeting about a piece from Sarah Brown from the Chronicle about Latinos feeling left out of the college race. There's a demographic and some stats now that they left college in droves during the pandemic. There's also some traditional leniency in some of those demographics about going to higher education because, traditionally it was a labor force or a working class thing. They're starting to spread out now. That's something else that really, really changes the perspective, both inwardly of themselves and how people outside should perceive them.
Yes, absolutely. And like, it's funny because Sarah and I were talking about this. And Sarah's an old friend. I've known Sarah for 10 years and we were classmates at UNC together. And like she pointed out that a lot of Latinos, if they left during the pandemic because they didn't. A lot of Latinos see college, I think, in a way that's different from a lot of other groups. They don't see the value of the liberal arts, the general education as much as other people do. They need to see a direct correlation between jobs and education. And I think when the pandemic hit and a lot of people went remotely, some people said, well, I got to afford to feed my family. And a lot of Latinos, of course, who are frontline workers who work in the service industry, their parents couldn't afford to pay for it. And on top of that, one interesting stat that I didn't notice was that, but I know for a fact from my own experience, and a lot of Latinos don't like going into debt when it comes to going to college. They prefer to pay as they go. It was really out of the ordinary when I took out student loans to go to university. And I just paid off my student loans last year because I wrote a book. But that was so different from the experience. Even my cousin Andrea, she played soccer for Baylor. The way she started playing soccer when God knows how young she was, but it was with the explicit expectation that she would get a scholarship to play soccer. So that's another part, is that the expense of college is also prohibitive. And if they don't see that this is a worthwhile return on investment, it's really easy to see people drop off. A perfect example of this is my dad. My dad went to school at East Carolina University for like 2 years, but then he got a job. And he was just like, okay, I got a job. Like, I don't need a college degree. So he went like 30 years without having a degree until like 1990, until like 2003. He went back and got his degree online or something like that. But it's not like that. So I think that's one of the other things, is that Latinos are leaving the workforce because of the pandemic, because they're not reaping the immediate benefits. But that comes as a detriment, because the more that employers require education, and the more that they require people to have a college degree, the less Latinos are going to have the opportunities to succeed.
Yeah, and I kind of think about talking to Eric Garcia. I just think about my own family, like my mom and dad's generation. They came up, they both graduated high school and went to college in the 60s. They were the first generation of either side of my family to ever go to college, either side. And by default, they're the first generation to not live in abstract poverty, going all the way back to the old country, whichever way you want to cut it. Is part of this just generational shifts where you have, multiple generations of Latinos in the country now? They're finding their own way, and some of them, whether through technology or just we've talked about the economic growth that's changed the political landscape of it. They're just going, hey, we want more, but the traditional path of getting more, it may not be college, it may be working through government, it may be working through the police force, it may be working through entrepreneurship. There's a huge mass into the digital realm and new media and things like this. Isn't this just kind of a natural generation shift that all demographics are going to go through?
Natural generation shift, and it is a natural thing because, like, I think back. So, like, before I set foot in a university, I went to community college, and a lot of people who were at community college weren't even getting they're to get a 4-year degree. They were going to get a certificate. And, like, a lot of people were getting degrees in auto technology, or they were getting their nursing certification. Um, and even so, like, I grew up in Chino Hills, California, which was a very suburban, largely white, largely college educated. But I went to community college in Chino, which was just right next door. That's where my family ancestrally was from. I want to say it's about like 50% Latino, something like not like a quarter of or a fifth had a college education, but it was largely working class. It was largely, there were a lot of mechanics, plumbers, people who worked in trades, and I think that they saw that, you're seeing now that more Latinos might be going to school because they saw that, like, we want more and we want to be able to get a job. But at the same time, I think that what universities need to do to attract Latinos, is they need to say specifically, okay, this is going to be the thing that allows you to get a job, even if you don't wind up getting a job in the degree you specialized in. This is the beneficial thing because it'll enable you to move up. Because a lot of Latinos, I think about even my own family. My dad would say that, like, he's a proud Latino man and he's proud, of his heritage. But he also said that, like, our family is a lot like, he would say, and he did say, our family is a lot like the Irish, and our family is a lot like Jewish Americans and Italians and Poles and, the other people who came from old countries and then, moved up in the world and became, American. So I think that's the other thing, is that universities need to do a better job of saying that, okay, Latinos are in this country, a lot of them by, as you saw, the census numbers are showing they're growing by birth, that a college education is a way to be firmly established and have firm footing. But I'm not seeing that as of right now. Some schools are doing it, but I would like to see it more on a widespread scale, to show that, like, there's a benefit to going to school.
Yeah, talking to Eric Garcia, reporter for The Independent, writer all over the place. Good guy, talking a little Latino. When we come back, we're going to get into his day job, Congress, how it's covered, what they're up to, that sort of thing. We'll get into that with Eric Garcia right after this on Hertel. Welcome back to Hertel, talking to Eric Garcia. Okay, your day job, you cover Congress. You call it the Malarkey Factory.
Yes.
We bash on Congress because they deserve it, but take us behind the scenes real quick, because we don't just cover the news here and react to the news. We want to know how the news gets made. Take us behind the scenes. Tell people what it's like to actually cover Congress, what a gaggle is, what it's like to chase Joe Manchin down a hallway to try to get a 30-second soundbite that was the same soundbite from 6 months ago. Committee hearings. There's a lot going on the Hill. You have the Senate, you have the House. Take us behind the scenes, what it's like to actually try to get information out to the people about Congress.
Like, I compare it a lot. I was talking with my mom about this. I compare it a lot to whale watching, because what happens is you will have, like, you can go, because, like, especially doing committee hearings, especially if it's not something you specifically want to cover, but you're trying to catch someone, you could wait like an hour, 2 hours for someone. And I think that, like, especially when I work for a publication like The Independent, which thrives on high metabolism journalism, and it's very much of that tradition of, like, of British tabloids, where you have go, go, go. It's hard to sometimes convince them that, like, hey, sometimes I need to wait outside for 2 hours or 3 hours. So that's one thing. But I think what's important to recognize is that the House and the Senate are two completely different animals. I think people say, well, what's the difference? The Senate is very much more collegial in a lot of ways. One of the points that I like to make is that a full year after um, the riot at the Capitol, Kirsten Gillibrand and Josh Hawley were working on legislation to end non-disclosure of forced arbitration on sexual harassment. They don't agree on anything else, but they work. They, by virtue of the Senate being the Senate, they have to work together because there's fewer colleagues. There's only 100 of them because of the filibuster. Anything you have to do, and Gillibrand has told me this much, that you have to work together. The House is, it's kind of like junior high. There's factions, there's pettiness, there's this propensity to just want to fight the other person. There's less of an incentive to work together. And I think the other thing that's important to recognize is that, to your point about waiting outside for a gaggle, the House can sometimes be in for votes for like 2 hours. They'll be on the floor, and you just got to sometimes wait for 2 hours on the floor. um, I mean, or outside. The reporters will all just be waiting outside, and you can't really leave because if somebody comes out, you have to be there for them. But then you also kind of can't. You also kind of can't leave. So like, for example, I have my work phone and I have my cell phone. At one point or another, I'm usually charging one or the other back in my desk in the gallery, in the press gallery, because I don't want to run out of power when I'm waiting to talk, when I'm waiting to record someone. And then like sometimes I'm like, because I've literally gone to use the bathroom or change my phone or charge my phone, and then I've missed someone that I need to do, that I need to catch. But then like sometimes what happens is that there'll just be a flurry of people coming through that you need to catch. And that's just one of those times where you need to be judicious. So for example, I'll give you the perfect example is that one day I needed to catch both AOC and Nancy Mace. And that was when Nancy Mace was having her kind of war of words with Marjorie Taylor Greene. And it was kind of a split decision that I was like, I can always catch AOC, but like at the moment I needed to catch Nancy Mace. And literally AOC passed by me, but I was like, it sucks. I needed to catch her too because I wanted to get her thoughts on Lauren Boebert saying something really racist about Ilhan Omar, but I also needed to catch this. So sometimes that's the calculation you make. On the other hand, I think that's why you need to build up sources with staffers, because sometimes staffers will tell you, because one of the things about it that I've learned is that members often don't have time to know everything, but their staffers are the ones who learn the most stuff. So that's why it's important to build up good relationships with staffers. That's why, you can't really do it. You can't do it as we couldn't do it as much in the pandemic, but that's why you go to get dinner with them, or you go to have drinks with them or lunch with them. But then sometimes I'll tell you the funniest story one of my funniest stories that I have about covering Congress this was back in November when there was that negotiation. They were determining whether to vote on the bipartisan infrastructure bill or not. And all the progressives were huddled in. This is an important distinction. Everybody thinks that all the offices are on the Capitol. There are actually 6 different buildings aligning the Capitol. Andrew, you know this, but like on the House side, there's Rayburn, Cannon, and Longworth. And then on the Senate side, there is Russell, Hart, and Dirksen. So we were all waiting in Longworth because progressives were meeting for like 3 or 4 hours. And the other thing was, because I have a few members, I have like one member's cell number, so I couldn't text them because they all left their phones out on the table before, so that nobody would leak to the press. And then like midway through, you start seeing all their phones light up. And later on, I learned from like reading another dispatch that it was Pelosi calling them, so that she knew they were all in a meeting, but she wanted the first thing that they would see is that they got a voicemail for the speaker, so that, to put the fear of God into them. So sometimes that happens. And then other times, the funniest thing is that other times like stories will fall into your lap. So I don't know. So like the big thing that's being discussed in Congress is whether to ban members of Congress from trading stocks. So one time I had this really nuanced, like 5-minute conversation with Senator John Ossoff, who's the sponsor of one of the main pieces of legislation. And then after we walked all the way back to his office building, and on my way back, I caught Senator Tommy Tuberville and I'd seen in Business Insider. By the way, everybody should be reading Business Insider. You got to subscribe to them, but it's absolutely worth it because they've done a whole thing about which members of Congress have violated the Stock Act and possibly traded with stocks with private information. I saw that Tommy Tuber was a serial violator. So I asked, I was like, Senator, then I realized I need to call him Coach because he prefers that. And I was like, what do you think about this? And he says, I think it's absolutely ridiculous. We might as well be sending robots up here. And then I tweeted that out, and guess which one got the most attention? Was it the nuanced conversation with John Ossoff, or was it the 30 seconds I had with Tommy Tuberville? You can guess which one got more attention. So sometimes that happens. You're like, I spend all day slaving over a story, and then that's the one that gets the most attention.
Yeah, it's the same way in the print world. You'll write this 3,000 in-depth word piece, and then you do this one little blurb about something that goes viral and gets all the hits. So I feel your pain, buddy. All right, how different is it going to be this year from last year? Last year, of course, a lot of hope. The year was dominated by Build Back Better and that agenda, infrastructure, all that good stuff. How much different is Congress going to feel when it comes back? They're on break right now. When they come back, they've got some heavy stuff to need to do. Of course, the Ukraine situation. And of course, the big bomb, the biggest thing that ever happens in Washington media. We're going to have a Supreme Court pick coming up. And it's an election year, a midterm election year. How different is Congress going to feel when they do it this year as opposed to all of last year?
So first and foremost, they also still need to do, they were negotiating a CR, a continuing resolution. So it looks like Senator Mitch McConnell wants there to just be continuing resolution after continuing resolution, rather than just fully funding the government for a fiscal year. So that's one thing that's going to be fun, is just kicking the can down the road and not passing a full budget. The other thing that's happening is, of course, they're probably going to have to pass Ukraine's, not only any legislation on sanctions, because even Democrats are saying that President Biden's sanctions aren't enough. Adam Schiff, chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, said it's a good start, but it's not enough. So they're going to have to pass some sanctions bills. They're going to have to also pass military aid, some kind of aid to Ukraine, whether it's military aid or foreign aid or some kind of thing to support Ukraine. On top of that, as you mentioned, the Supreme Court nomination. The interesting thing that I've noticed is that Republicans are kind of split on it. So Mitch McConnell, literally, he was at an event in Lexington yesterday. He says, I don't have an objection to President Biden picking a black woman for a Supreme Court nominee. Senator Lindsey Graham, who was the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, or was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, but now he's Grassley's the ranking member. He said it's fine. He wants him and Jim Clyburn and Tim Scott and a few other South Carolinians want Biden to pick J. Michelle Childs. Other people wanted to pick Ketanji Brown Jackson, who's a former public defender. So that'll be, but what's interesting is that conservatives seem to really not be that interested in having a kind of, for lack of a better term, a cockfight about it, like you saw with Amy Coney Barrett or Brett Kavanaugh or Neil Gorsuch or even Merrick Garland, because they kind of won. They have the 6-3 conservative majority. So it would be the equivalent of putting your starters on when the tournament's in 2 weeks and you're a number 1 seed. So I don't expect there to be a full-on assault, because it's replacing Stephen Breyer, it's replacing a liberal, so that's what's going to happen. You're not going to see any movement, I don't think, on BBB. Manchin has already said it's dead. There's talks that the negotiations might not even begin until March again, but by then everybody's going to be campaigning again. I think that by June or July, you're not going to see any progress on anything, just because everybody's out campaigning. And on top of that, so you've got, 3 Democrats are at risk of losing 3 Senate seats, Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. And then Republicans look pretty likely to take back the House. So I doubt that you're going to see any big changes. The other thing that's going to be interesting to see is that the Select Committee for January 6th, they've said they're going to start having public hearings. I don't know if they're going to start having, when they're going to have it. I've been hearing for the longest time. I've been asking my people I know on the committee, when the hearings are going to start, and radio silence. So who knows if they'll actually happen, but they do have their mandate. The mandate is that this ends at the beginning of the next Congress. So who knows what happens.
Yeah, Eric Garcia, great insight on Congress. All right, let's project out a little bit. I know we hate to do that because you're a reporter, you deal with facts, but I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. Let's assume that the Republicans do take the House. The Senate's a little more iffy, but if they get the House, I want to ask you, because this is a story that's going to develop later. There's already whispers, there's the backbiting. How secure is Kevin McCarthy if they get the majority? Because we hear a lot of stuff. There's a lot of rumors. He's got all kinds of issues. We know nobody really respects him because a couple of years ago they literally went with their hat in hand to get Paul Ryan to take it instead of him. And God bless him, Walter Jones kneecapped him the first time, but we'll talk about that story some other time. Rest in peace, Walter Jones. But just because they get the majority, I think they could have a real mess on their hands right off the jump, just in the leadership and those sorts of fights that come once you take over the majority.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that a lot of conservatives got mad at McCarthy for not holding the line on infrastructure. That was really the beginning. And then there was a lot of frustration with the fact that he couldn't keep his caucus in line on voting for the creation of a bipartisan commission for January 6th. There is a lot of feeling that McCarthy let me put it this way, that's when he gave his kind of 9-hour long floor speech the night that the House was supposed to pass Build Back Better, that was for an audience of one. That was for former President Donald Trump. And then he got praise from Trump after that. But that doesn't mean that he's secure. There's still talk about Steve Scalise might leapfrog him. There's talk about even someone like Jim Banks, who is chairman of the Republican Study Conference. I forget that. I think that's their term. Republican Study Committee. There's talk that he might leapfrog him. There is not. I think that the feeling with McCarthy is that he's just not somebody who's up to the job. The upside for him is that he has a lot of friends. A lot of people like him. He recruited a lot of those initial 2010 Republicans who won the majority back in the Republican wave year. But the question is whether they like him enough to keep him there, and whether or not they think that it's up to the task of blocking anything that President Biden wants to do, blocking anything that, if the Senate stays Democratic, blocking anything Chuck Schumer wants, and really enacting or putting forward a conservative agenda. I don't think that there is. I think it's still up in the air. The difference between him and I think Paul Ryan and John Boehner was McCarthy has made a better, more concerted effort to reach out to Jordan and the Freedom Caucus guys, whereas Boehner hated them too much to ever want to deal with them, and Ryan could never satisfy them. It seems like McCarthy has brought them more into the fold.
Something to keep an eye on. We always like to try to stay ahead of the news a little bit, not just reaction to it. We appreciate it. Eric Garcia, always enjoy catching up with you, my friend. Let folks know where they can follow your coverage and also follow your other, and make sure you pitch that amazingly great book, We're Not Broken. It is certified by Trish Donaldson, my mother, former special education teacher, who refers to you as that nice young man. Tell folks about the book, your social media, and where they can follow you.
You can follow me on Twitter, Eric M. Garcia. You can read my reporting at The Independent, or you can read my columns at MSNBC. You can also buy my book, We're Not Broken, Change the Autism Conversation. The paperback edition comes out May 31st. Deals with a lot of other stuff that we weren't able to go into in the hardcover edition. There's an afterword about the COVID vaccine panic and how it was linked to the anti-vaccine panic of the 1990s with autism. There's a lot, so there's a lot of good bits there, but the hardcover is also a lot of fun things. So it's always fun talking with you, Andrew, and thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, we're going to have you back on because we're going to get into that anti-vax autism connection one of these days, because there's some really untoward, wicked stuff in there we're going to deal with. Eric Garcia, fantastic, my friend. I really appreciate your time. I hope you heal up. Thanks for playing hurt today, buddy.
Thanks, man.
Anytime.